Thanks for joining for this episode of the TechSpective Podcast. I have with me Mark Lambert from ArmorCode. So, Mark, if you would like to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on the company.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So my name is Mark Lambert. I'm the Chief Product Officer here at ArmorCode. And in essence, what we are is we're an agentic AI platform for unified exposure management. We've been on the market for a little over 5 years now, and we help organizations at enterprise scale handle their application security posture management, unified vulnerability management workflows.
All right. Curious. So you say you're an agentic AI, unified exposure management, but also been around for 5 years. Was there a transition there, or because to me, and I realize that for people who work in AI and work and actually develop this stuff, it's not that new. But for me, agentic AI is like a 2-year-old thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when you started 5 years ago, was agentic AI the main focus at that point, or was there a pivot?
No, I would say that is I wouldn't use the word pivot. It's evolution as to how the industry and how we take technologies and adopt them, right? So when we started about 5 years ago, we were very much talking about aggregation and analytics at scale. So, for example, today we ingest over 350 different sources of security data. We bring those into the platform, the aggregation piece, and then the analytics piece at that point, 5 years ago, was in essence mostly algorithmic based, touch of machine learning. But really, what we've seen over the last few years as technologies evolve is that we've been able to build a agentic layer on top of the platform services that we have, so that we're able to orchestrate agentic workflows around correlation, triage, and remediation. So the first truly agentic piece that we introduced to the market was actually last year. So at RSA last year, we introduced Anya, which is our agentic interface. And then over the last 12 months, we've been expanding that, using it internally as a framework to release agentic workflows inside of the platform. And then actually we're about to launch our Anya agents, which are customizable workflows that customers can deploy within the ArmorCode UI platform, but also leverage from LLM processes from our MCP server, for example. So it's an evolution as to how you take technologies and adopt them to solve the problem that you're fundamentally solving for customers.
Okay. Makes sense and totally fair. One of the things, in all the various conversations I've had for the last 2-3 years, from OpenAI coming on the scene and generative AI, agentic AI, I've on more than one occasion reiterated okay, well, all of this is great and new and it's amazing and it's all moving very fast. But for the record, in the world of cybersecurity, AI wasn't new. We were already doing AI ML going back a decade.
Yeah. No, in a prior life, we were using machine learning to identify false positives within static application security testing data, and we were leveraging here at ArmorCode machine learning to identify patterns, to identify similar findings. So when you look at a particular finding and you apply a triaging use case to it, so say, hey, this thing's a false positive, then tell me the other things that look like it, so that I can also potentially take that same action on those other things as well. So yeah, as a foundational technology, I think the big change has been the launch of the LLMs and generative AI, which has just opened up so many more use cases that can be further accelerated or made more efficient by leveraging AI as part of that process.
Okay. All right. Well, so one of the things that I think one of the main things I want to try to focus our conversation on is this the State of AI Risk Management report that you guys did in conjunction with our Purple Book community. There's a survey of 650, I believe, cybersecurity leaders. One of the questions I like to ask whenever I'm talking to somebody about a report like this is the sort of what stood out to you? Because I think there's a lot of stuff that's going to be like, okay, yeah, there's agentic AI or whatever, but I feel like there's always something in there that is surprising or whatever. But so let's just start there. What's kind of your big takeaway from this report?
Yeah, so there were a few really good takeaways from the report, and I think the biggest one for me was this disconnect between visibility and control. So over 80% of organizations, almost 90% of organizations expressed that they had complete visibility into their AI technology, so AI inventory, the inventory of the technologies that have been used inside of their organization. However, less than 60% less than 40% actually have control over that. So there was 60% of the organizations expressed that that AI usage was completely ungoverned. Then there were additional metrics that kind of further layered on top of this, things like, hey, we've got a lot of controls in place, but vulnerabilities are still escaping into production. So that really talks to the use case of leveraging AI as part of our activity for creating and generating code, but then the detection and the controls that we have in place is still insufficient. And then the third metric was all around wasting time chasing additional vulnerabilities that potentially are not actually high business impacting. And that problem, that third problem, is going to get exponentially worse with what's been happening with Mythos and related LLMs, which are now going to be discovering a whole bunch more 0 days.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, and I could be wrong about this, but I take a little segue there. When I saw the story about Mythos, and there have been other similar things with generative and agentic AI, where it's like, they recognize what it could do, and they said, hey, you know what, that probably isn't a good thing to release to the general public. Let's get a little cabal together of the major players, and let's try to get ahead of this and figure out how we can work with this before this becomes public. Makes perfect sense. I remember a few years back, Microsoft announced they shared a proof of concept, and they announced that they had developed a tool that with 30 seconds of audio content from you, they could deep fake your voice. And they said, well, we want to announce that we've figured this out, but we're not going to release this to the public because that's dangerous. And so I respect that. But my next thought, as someone who has worked in this industry for 20 plus years, is, okay, but if you can do it, someone else can do it too. So just because you're showing some level of ethics with your model doesn't mean it's not a risk. It just means someone else out there has got the same model probably.
Yeah, it's a short-term risk mitigation strategy, right? We're going with the presumption that others are maybe behind where Anthropic is, but your point is exactly that. Really, what we're going to see is these three ways, right? The first way, we're going to see the critical infrastructure, like browsers, operating systems, and the like. We're going to see a whole bunch of CVEs that are going to be released as part of those organizations that are part of the Glasswing project, right? So we're going to see a first wave of vulnerabilities there. Then, the intent is that that's going to come out pretty quickly, because I think by Anthropic's own estimation, it was, if I remember correct, 6 to 18 months before this kind of class of LLM is going to be generally available. Well, I think, shocker, there's probably your nation state actors probably already have access to things which are as advanced, I would imagine. So your first wave are going to be the first wave of 0 days discovered by critical infrastructure. Your second wave is going to be when a Mythos level LLM is accessible to just general threat researchers. That's where we're going to be finding a whole bunch more things inside of open source. And also that's obviously where threat actors are going to start leveraging those vulnerabilities as well. The third wave, which may happen around about the same time as the second wave, is actually those nation state actors where they've been capturing code bases typically through means to capture intellectual property, but now they have access to code bases that belong to commercial entities that they can start running these LLMs on to uncover vulnerabilities that they can exploit to move laterally within deployed instances of those technologies. So your point to say, hey, it's very very ethical to say, hey, we're not going to give this to everybody, but it's really a temporary strategy to get ahead of that that broader use case.
Yeah. Going back to some of what you cited as the things from the report that kind of stood out to you. Why do you think? And this is, I guess, semi-rhetorical, but why do you think organizations right now are struggling so much with shadow AI and AI-generated code risks? Even though there's always that disconnect. So even though they believe they have visibility, so I feel like there are so many cybersecurity reports like that where it's like when you ask the question, do you understand what the problem is, and you get 90% are like, yes, we understand what the problem is, and it's like, all right, well, do you understand? Are you prepared? And most are like, oh, it's not a problem for us. We're prepared. We're fine. And it's like, okay, well, those two things don't really match up all the time. You can't possibly be, always part of the small percentage that is prepared.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, or one of the really, if you think about it from a macro level, the thing that really stood out in that report is that disconnect. It's like the same people that are saying, hey, I've got the inventory, are the same people that are saying it's ungoverned. As the same people that are saying, hey, we've got all of the things in place to prevent vulnerabilities from escaping into production environments, and we've got secure development processes on AI, the same people that are saying, oh yeah, but we do have vulnerabilities that are getting out into production environments. So I think the pressure that we have to recognize that the industry is under is we can all see such great productivity gains, and our ability to deliver business value to our customers is so tremendous that there is a level of, hey, let's adopt and then figure it out later. Now, the thing is, you can actually put things in place to mitigate those risks. And that's where, I think a lot of organizations are trying to do the right first steps. Certainly when you think about the introduction of AI into our environment, and I often think about it as two use cases, right? The first use case is what we can do to drive our own productivity gains, and then the second use case is what we deliver value to users and our customers, be them internal or external. And what you have to do is you have to provide business context to both of those use cases to really understand what your business risk is. So if I've got AI to generate code, this is one that we talk about a lot at ArmorCode, right? If I'm using AI to generate code, that's actually not a bad thing. It's actually a great thing. Even though depending on which reports you read, AI, let's say conservatively, is giving me 4x productivity gain. And it's worst case scenario generating about the same vulnerability density as a human. Let's say it's actually half that, right? Because it's actually it's going to get better if it's not already in certain environments if you put the right guardrails in place. That's still increasing the volume of and velocity of vulnerabilities. So 4x multiplier with like a 50% reduction still means a 2x multiplier. We still see, though, that the ability to be able to get those productivity gains are there. So what we do then is we educate our developer community as to how to effectively leverage AI. So we're not introducing complex business logic flaws, that we are putting the right controls around the AI development. The challenge is that AI has actually reduced the barrier to entry for somebody to start being a citizen developer, to use a term that we were using about a decade ago. Citizen developers are those which are not really classically trained from the point of view of a software development process, and certainly not made aware of security best practices. That's where the risk is in your organization. So while using AI to generate code is a good thing, what you want to be able to do is to identify the places where that's being used that maybe sit outside of your normal controls that you would have in your environment.
Okay. I want to go back a step to talking about the Mythos perspective and Glasswing, and when you were talking about it, like it had sort of dawned on me before, but I didn't really think about it until you were talking, and I was like, they say that they can, they're going to uncover all these, it's so much better at finding these flaws, and we're going to have all these CVEs, and I was like, well, wait a minute, we already, most organizations already don't do a great job of patching everything and struggle to keep up with the CVEs we already have. If we 10x that, what's that going to look like from a patch management perspective?
Yeah, and not even just from a patch management perspective. I mean, if you shift a little left in the stack there, right, you start thinking about software that we're building, traditional application security tooling, like static application security testing, generates a lot of data, and typically that is usually equated to noise because it's not concrete in its precision. Now with things like Mythos, identifying real vulnerabilities within the code base, that's just going to increase the importance of application security and how we can mobilize. So then the question becomes like, okay, so I've got the same problem that I already had, which is just a massive volume of vulnerabilities, whether they're CVEs or they're vulnerabilities discovered within my own code base through my own analysis, AI red teaming, which is the latest thing, right? Or some kind of like vulnerability assessment program internally. How do I now figure out which ones to? So there's actually going to be kind of like a further expansion of your risk-based vulnerability management programs or workflows, which are taking into account not just the technical risk of a vulnerability, but also the business risk. Again, a little bit talking to what I was saying before, is like understanding where your business risk is around the use of a particular AI. Because if I have a vulnerability, though, if that's in a back-end data sciences application versus a front-end business critical web application, those have different priorities, even if they're exactly the same underlying vulnerability. Now, further, so I can leverage risk to prioritize. Then I want to be able to also leverage AI to actually identify duplicate findings. So I'm going to have the same vulnerability reported by multiple sources within my technology stack. I need to reduce that data set. It's all about reducing the volume of data to being the things that you need to action upon. So, and again, like tippy top of this prioritization pyramid will be those things that are being actively exploited in your environment. Next level down are those which can be exploited within your environment. And then probably the next level down from that is probably things which have a high EPSS or a high, or it's already in some kind of exploited catalog. Now, once I've figured out which are the things I need to look at, I then need to figure out what my strategy to resolve those are. And this is where you want to bring in two strategies, either remediate or mitigate. And this is where, again, things like LLMs can really help, because this is a big data problem. So if I'm figuring out, okay, what patches do I want to go ahead and push? Those are going to be correlated with your business risk. It's also going to be correlated with those patches that are going to have the biggest ROI associated with that effort. But if I'm talking about pushing a patch or even a code-based change, if it's code that I'm developing internally, the impact of those to my business can be significant. So what can I do to mitigate those in the short term, or maybe longer term, depending upon your organizational risk? So mitigating those with other controls within my framework. And again, this is where something like an LLM can take that context of the vulnerability, of the patch, of the finding, combining that with your mitigating controls to give you a proposed plan that you can then execute more effectively, and optimizing how you spend the business resources.
Okay. One of the things I think is kind of like I think it's a useful or valid point for people to understand that, like, ultimately AI, I mean, it is just software, it is just code. And so, like, yes, it seems like it's, magic and it does all these great things, but on one level, it's not fundamentally different than when we, everything migrated to cloud, or when everyone, started adopting SaaS, and, we've had other sort of like massive shifts in how, enterprise software works and things like that, and that have also come with exposures and risks that needed to be understood and mitigated and remediated. I think that where it becomes different, or where, it is the fact that is just more of a speed and scale problem than anything. It's just that, because it's agentic AI and it can actually take actions on behalf, of a person, or, and that it has its own set of sort of permissions and access, that the types of problems and the rate at which those problems can occur is heightened. But we still have to remember that it's just code. It's just software running in your system.
Yeah. I think your point around this scale and speed of adoption, I think is spot on, right? If we think about open source, when we started adopting that, took many years for us to get the controls in place and for organizations to embrace the adoption of open source. Cloud went through a similar journey, although probably about half the time, and COVID really pushed that. If we think about the adoption of AI, it's compressed even further. And a lot of that is driven by, I think, two things. And one is the clear value, right? The immediacy of the outcome. And then the second is the ease of embedding it into the workflows that you have today. Now, the other thing to think about here too is, look, we've always had automations, right? Whether it's somebody writing a script somewhere, whether it's somebody using a no-code automation like we have inside of ArmorCode, there will always be automations that would run. The trick is, those automations would have a bound scope that they would be able to do that. And the same is true when we talk about agentic workflows. Agentic workflows, the term of the day is agency, right? The amount of your control and scope that those agentic workflows have to execute. So, one of the things that we've actually done with our Anya agents that I referenced earlier is we've actually integrated those into our no-code automation, our runbook. So you can actually specify the scope of what those agentic actions have the ability to do within those automation workflows. And I think you have to consider that there are a number of things which are often very low value tasks for a human to do and are obvious to do with a little bit of intuition, which is what an LLM gives you the ability to deploy. It's kind of like having a junior person on the team. So what do you do with a junior person on the team? Well, you give them scope of things that, what's the worst that could happen? The next level up are the things that you review. And then there are things that you don't give to them at all, because no matter what they're going to do, probably wouldn't be the right thing. It's the same with agents, and it's the same with agentic services. So you want to scope the level of agency based upon the criticality, the business risk, the ability to be able to reverse a decision if you determine that that decision was the wrong decision.
Yeah, I think that's. I had another conversation recently that where we talked in similar terms of saying that AI agents are going to make mistakes, and to the analogy you just used in terms, I've also often used, which is to say, I envision. In my head, I treat AI agents like I'm hiring a team of interns. I treat them as, I think of them as employees. And if you think of hiring a team of interns or entry-level people, you would assign them tasks, and like, again, you just walked through the scenario. You would assign them tasks, but you wouldn't just give them the keys to the kingdom. You wouldn't expect perfect results out of the gate. You would monitor and follow up and make sure that they stay within the guardrails and that the output is what you expected. And the point that was made was, so you need to be sort of selective about making sure that the things that you're assigning to these AI agents are things that can be undone. That kind of is the key. It's like, hey, mistakes are going to be made. Let's just keep our fingers crossed that they're not irreversible mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is where the term, as you said earlier, your AI is being used for a long time, right? The term which we've often used is human in the loop, right? Especially when we're talking about decisions that you don't have a way of coming back from. So one of the things that I've seen in the industry as, one of the things I'm very fortunate to be able to do is actually talk with many different organizations of different shapes and sizes, different industries. And, if we were to have been talking this time last year when we first launched Anya, I would see a significant uptick in experimental use, but then I would see a certain amount of concern, especially within regulatory organizations, around even around, hey, how's the data managed and all of these things. Now, over the last 12 months, two things have happened. Firstly, a lot has become more clearer as to how you can deploy agentic software, or even just generative AI as to kind of like some of those best practices. And then the other driver has been exactly as we were talking about earlier, which is where the value that organizations see with the deployment of AI has just been realized very quickly. And organizations that don't embrace AI are actually going to be falling by the wayside. The trick always becomes, though, making sure that it's being leveraged at different phases. So, for example, when I talk to the community, the majority of organizations have embraced AI as an advisor. I think we're on the cusp of AIs being deployed in a truly autonomous way, but again, within a certain scope of agency. Your analogy of, hey, I've just hired a bunch of interns is very much the way that I think that the software development industry is going. So it's going from a team lead managing a team of human developers to that team lead managing a fleet of agentic developers. And the ability for the human to provide value here is all of a sudden the human doesn't have to do the mundane work, but the human has to provide the guidance. And also, I mean, I'm sure you've used AI in numbers of different use cases. 9 times out of 10, you still have to review what it comes back with. You're not going to just copy and paste and push out, but there are certain use cases where the risk of that is much less. And especially when we start talking about vulnerability management, for example, I talked about quickly a conversation of the prioritization pyramid. There are a whole bunch of medium, low level CVEs that as an industry, we're never going to get to those. I mean, let's just be real, right? But if you can have an AI review all of those and push up or push down the ones that it thinks might be a problem or definitely are not, you've now just actually reduced the anxiety and also that backlog significantly. You can start applying that further up the prioritization pyramid, not to eliminate things, but to push things further up or push things further down the prioritization list. And I think that's where that's where we are today. Right. Is AI being used in those ways, and its agency being very much controlled by the scope of the business risk.
Okay. So the thing you were saying about you don't want to just copy and paste, and I would go back to saying if you think of AI agents like a team of interns that you've hired and you've assigned them tasks, it's like, again, you wouldn't assign them a task and say, okay, I need you to go. I want you to go out, gather all this research, and put together a report. If an intern did that, you would not take that report and say, present it to the board. without looking at it first, without reviewing it and saying, okay, well, is this actually valid information? Is this the report that I asked for? There are steps involved, and it's like, yes, you need to follow those same steps. When you're talking about AI, what I think is possibly, what I think is the challenge, is that where we are right now today with AI, I feel like that is somewhat doable because people are kind of like dipping their toe in. We're just starting to like launch agents. I mean, most people don't have 100 agents that they're managing or trying to work with, and so I can dabble with AI agents and I can check and I can be the human in the loop. I can review the output and say, okay, is this good? Is this not? But very quickly, we're going to get to the point where it's like that's not feasible. Like the whole, like part of the whole promise and the potential of this is like, Tony Bradley, can have 100 agents so that I can potentially apply what I'm able to accomplish. And in doing so, I will get it to a point where like the agents will be doing so much so fast, I can't possibly review it all. Otherwise, that would take away from the point. I'll be the bottleneck that slows everything down back to human speed.
Yeah, I think you touched on a very clear point, right? Because even today, right, most people that I talk to are initiating multiple AI sessions or multiple agents at the same time, or even if you're using something like a Claude Cowork, right, you'll have multiple. We're using it so that we can be more efficient with the multitasking, taking away a lot of the wasted cycle drudgery work, right? I think it really will come down to honing what a human is actually doing, and we'll be focused on the high value work from the point of view of a human, and we'll. I don't know. Yeah. Now we're talking prediction, which
right.
I've always said I never like really doing, because like especially in this world that we're in,
especially now, yes,
yeah, it's moving very very fast. But that Gartner has this thing called the what do they call it? The hype cycle. That's it. So you got this. What it has this peak of hyped expectations, and then it goes into what's called the trough of disillusionment, right? Which sounds really bad. What it actually means is like, hey, yeah, we've figured out that all of those nirvana states that were described aren't actually all where we're going to be, and we're figuring out. And then the next stages are, I think it's the slope of enlightenment and then the plateau of productivity, if I'm remembering these correctly. That basically means is like, we're now figuring out what it can do, what it can't do, and now we've actually got to that productivity stage. Right now, we're kind of like right up there at the top right now from the point of view of where we all see the vision of the future. There's going to be at some point where we'll get to that natural point of figuring out where this works, where the point of acceleration stops, and at that point they will be our productivity gains. We're not at the point where we know where that is right now as an industry. I do agree with you that there's a point at which I, as a human, I still have to review this stuff because it's still not good enough. But I'd say the LLMs are getting better and better. I mean, there are some things which I used to spend a few iterative cycles to have to come up with something that's meaningful. Now it's actually the first cycle I'm like, yeah, that's actually good. So I would be able to give the agent the agency within the scope of that task, because the outcome is going to be minimal or marginally better by a human. I think that's the mode that we'll get into, where we're using the AI and we're saying, yep, actually now I have this level of confidence. I'm still going to want to be able to audit it. That's where companies are going to put in place policies around what level of autonomy an agent has. It was an interesting, so you referenced the Purple Book community earlier, who published the research on the state of AI risk management. The PBC Connect event at RSA had a very interesting fireside chat with Phil Venables, who was the previous CISO of Google Cloud, and Jason Clinton, who's the deputy CISO at Anthropic. And one of those conversations was around kind of like agent to agents, and like in a Sarbanes-Oxley world, could you in theory think of like, would the regulatory bodies allow just two agents to figure out all of that? And the reality is probably not. So the definition as to what can be fully autonomous, and making sure that you have the auditing in place, and that doesn't just mean, hey, agent X did Y, agent Z did Q. It's actually, especially when you think about a vulnerability management program, what was the decision criteria, and what was the action that was taken, and do I have the ability to be able to demonstrate that? Because AI can now fix code. So how do I know if the AI found the problem and fixed the problem? I still need something that's going to provide me that governance layer, so that when, from a regulatory perspective, when some kind of event happens, be it a security event or a business financial event, you still need to be able to go back to that traceability. Yeah.
Well, and this is, I'm sort of rehashing here, but one of the analogies I've used repeatedly when talking about handing things over to AI agents and allowing that automation, but having human in the loop, is because I think it's an analogy more people who don't work in IT and cybersecurity can relate to, is features on vehicles, and how, like, when we first came out with adaptive cruise control, it's like, all right, well, that's very cool, but the first time you do it, you very much keep your foot next to the brake pedal, because you don't know if you can trust the car to slow down and not hit the car in front of you. When they first came out with lane assist, it's like, all right, well, when I first tried that, I made sure I was on a wide open highway in the middle lane, no cars around me, so I could take my hands off the wheel and see, okay, will the car in fact stay in the middle of this lane? Will it take this curve without running off the highway? But I kept my hands right next to the steering wheel, because I didn't know that if I could trust it. So now I have a little bit more trust, and I have some element of trust for those things. But even when I have not done actual like Tesla self-driving or whatever, but like even in a full self-driving situation, the guidance is still, okay, but you should be alert. You should know what's going on. Like you should not hand over one. You can't just go to sleep and hope to wake up when you get to your destination. Like, you need to be involved in this, which sounds like it makes sense. But also, I've multiple times ridden in Waymos where I could have just gone to sleep and it would have been fine. But I feel like those are the steps that we have to kind of navigate through with AI agents. It's like there's the initial, okay, I'm keeping my hands next to the steering wheel, I'm keeping my foot next to the brake pedal. But the goal ultimately would be to get to like the level of trust where it's like, okay, I can just go to sleep. I don't need to be involved in this process.
Yeah, it's interesting you draw that analogy, because I'm the same as you. I have like a lane assist and adaptive cruise control in my truck, and I don't ever just turn it on and start reading a book, right? I'm always aware of what's going on. Now, what I will say is it decreases the cognitive load that you have to put on when you're performing that action, which is a good thing. But I've also ridden in the back of a bunch of Waymos. I think the reason why I'll happily take a Waymo and not worry about it is, if you look at one of those vehicles, like the amount of LiDAR systems and technology that's in place, that is much better than what I'm getting in my pickup truck, right? So right. I think there's a level of trust between the different types of agents. I mean, you're right, it's the same use case, but I'm leveraging very different that
could be a whole separate podcast. That is an interesting segue, because I am aware that is a fundamental difference between Waymo and Tesla, and that Musk has insisted that, well, we only need cameras, because humans drive with their eyeballs. Humans don't have radar that can see around the corner and through buildings. So if a human can do it, then so can a Tesla with its cameras. But I think thus far, and I don't have the data at hand, but thus far, I feel like Waymo is winning that argument, that it is a safer, more reliable system. And why wouldn't it be? Like like you said, it's like when you look at the number of sensors and LiDAR, and like it can see through the building to know what car is coming from around the corner before you get there, which is something you cannot do as a human.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. This could be a whole independent podcast, right? But I was, the vehicle that I have, I will not name the brand, but it's not a Tesla. And I can tell you there's a level of trust that I do not have with that technology. And I think that's the piece, is like the validation. Like, and I've ridden in, Teslas that have the self-driving, and it's actually really impressive. The trust that I have in my pickup truck is very low because of observed behavior. The trust I have in a Waymo is very high because of observed behavior, in addition to my kind of geekiness of understanding the technology. I mean, I've been in a Waymo where I've seen it swerve to avoid a person that ran out in front of the street. I've seen it stop at a traffic light where I didn't see the pedestrian waiting to cross the road, but it did. So those are the things that build up my trust with that system. So yeah, but as you said, a whole other podcast that we could go down.
Right. Well, okay, so let's bring this back then. So if we you think about agentic AI and AI agents from an enterprise perspective, and like I said earlier, like we're just dabbling now, and every conversation I've had says this is going to be orders of magnitude exponential growth, like people who are dabbling today with like one or two agents just to see what they do. Well, once you get a hold of that, and you say, okay, now I understand what this agent can do and how it works. Well, now I can deploy 100 agents. And if every person in your company suddenly had 100 agents, this problem grows and grows and grows very, very quickly. How, like, what are your thoughts on like how do organizations then deal with governance and security? Like, how do you, what does effective governance look like in a system where employees each have 20 to 100 agents?
Well, I mean, in essence, what you've just done is you've increased your employee count, right? You've gone from having human employees to having a hybrid of human and non-human employees. So this all comes down to being able to do identity management, to understand what the different identities are doing. But the volume, this is the interesting double-edged sword of this thing, is that the volume of information that you're going to have about those identities means that you're going to have an AI that's monitoring the AIs. And then you're going to need to be able to interpret the data that comes from that and say, okay, again, mapping it back to the same conversation around vulnerabilities, is being able to understand what the business risk is associated with all of these actions. One of the things that AI is very good at is summarization and insights from large volumes of data. And guess what? That's the problem that we're going to start experiencing, is the massive volumes of data as it relates to the identities, what the identities are doing, and if they represent you a business risk. So it comes back to what we discussed, right? You're going to be managing a team of non-humans, be them a team of interns, be it a software development team, be it some other orchestrating business function.
Yeah. Well, so as we kind of like wind down here, like let's pull this all the way back to unified exposure management. To your point about one of the things that AI is really good at is analyzing large amounts of data. And a few years back, I worked with a startup that was not a agentic AI. It was pre-agentic AI. It was AI on some level, but really it was just security graph. It was just going back to old school security AI ML. But even in the security graph, like security, like I'm still like mind blown when I see it done effectively and stuff, because it's like you can take all of these things, and if you have the full picture of your environment, and you have visibility of all the devices, and you have an understanding of, well, what does your security posture look like, and you can put it all in to a system like that, then you can identify the choke points and you can say, okay, I don't need to fix 5,000 endpoints. I can just solve this one problem over here, and it mitigates all of this. And so again, that was pre-agentic AI. Well, now if I take agentic AI and I throw that at it, I would say that would be phenomenal at that scenario of doing this exposure management, to be able to, because the thing that the AI is really good at is the ability of taking in all of the telemetry and understanding how all of the dots connect, and being able to identify where those choke points are to give you some guidance and say, hey, look, if you do these things, you'll eliminate 90% of your problem.
Yeah, no, you're going down exactly the right track there, because if I think about the things like attack paths, for example, I'm going to have those from different sources. And historically, if we wanted to do something with those, then you'd have to look in that source and say, hey, you have to put all of the context into this source to be able to get the value out of this thing. Well, now I can take partial information from one place, partial information from another, combine these two things together that could be in completely different formats, and being able to have the LLMs give me an opinion, which at the end of the day, having a partner, which you can think of an AI agent as a partner, right? Having a peer or a partner that can help you say, hey, we should look at this thing in more detail, is very, very valuable, versus saying, I've got a sea of information, I have to try and figure it out, right? So one of the things that we're doing with the Anya agents is giving you the ability to plug these things together. So when you think about the context that an LLM has, you can actually expand that context. You can say, hey, tell me things around this individual finding that's coming from one source. Tell me about this collection of findings that's coming from different sources within a certain bounded scope. Then I could even go higher than that and say, okay, now I want to bring in design documents, network diagrams, all of this other context, so that I can provide insights, but also use those insights to prioritize and mobilize appropriate downstream efforts. So I think, the path forward, I think there's still a lot for us to explore as an industry. And certainly the thing that we've seen is that the value that you get out of leveraging large language models to really analyze this large volume of data, the insights really help you accelerate the teams. And then ultimately, that's where the agency starts kicking in, and you can start moving to the promise of autonomous oriented workflows, where you're not just taking in vulnerability management, but you're also taking that data and feeding it back in to the process, so that if I'm using AI to generate code, I can take that same contextual information and say, okay, let's create it better the first time around.
Yeah. Sounds good. I'm just looking for the part where we can just go to sleep. Yeah.
Sleep is overrated.
We'll go to sleep. We'll wake up. Everything will just be secure because the agents have taken care of it.
Well, I think again, that's another podcast.
Fair. But yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time. It was a fun conversation.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it as always.